Victoria Chen stood in the cramped storage room of her apartment building, holding what remained of her grandmother's silk wedding dress. The delicate ivory fabric hung in tatters, strategic cuts made with precision to ensure maximum devastation. Her younger sister Melissa had outdone herself this time. The dress that had been worn by 3 generations of Chen women was now nothing more than expensive rags. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The betrayal wasn't just in the destruction itself, but in the text message Victoria had received that morning from her mother. Melissa made a mistake. You know how emotional she gets before her own wedding. Surely you can find another dress. Family comes first. Victoria's hands trembled as she photographed the ruins of her heritage, documenting evidence for what would become the most important court case of her life. Her parents had enabled Melissa's destructive behavior for 26 years, but this time, they would face consequences they never saw coming. Victoria Chen had always been the responsible daughter, the one who followed rules, earned scholarships, and never caused trouble. Growing up in Sacramento, she learned early that her needs would always be secondary to her sister's dramatic demands. Melissa, 3 years younger, possessed an uncanny ability to transform every family gathering into her personal stage. The pattern established itself when Victoria was 8 years old. She had spent months preparing for her school's science fair, constructing an elaborate volcano that actually erupted with homemade lava. The night before the competition, Melissa decided she wanted to help. Within minutes, the project laid in ruins, victim to her sister's enthusiastic but clumsy assistance. When Victoria cried over her destroyed work, their mother Patricia immediately focused on consoling Melissa, who had begun sobbing dramatically about how mean Victoria was being. Victoria rebuilt the project that night with whatever material she could find, earning second place with her hastily assembled backup volcano. Melissa received ice cream for being brave enough to help her ungrateful sister, while Victoria was reminded that winning wasn't everything. This incident became the template for their entire childhood. Victoria would work diligently toward a goal, Melissa would interfere either intentionally or through careless enthusiasm, and their parents would prioritize managing Melissa's emotional response over addressing the actual damage caused. During high school, Victoria maintained a perfect grade point average while working part-time at the local library. She had her sights set on UC Berkeley's pre-law program, knowing that every scholarship dollar would be crucial for their middle-class family. Her dedication to academics meant sacrificing social activities, but Victoria understood the value of long-term planning. Melissa, meanwhile, floated through high school with barely passing grades. Her attention focused primarily on social media followers and dating older boys. When report cards arrived, their parents would celebrate Victoria's continued excellence with a brief acknowledgement before diving into lengthy discussions about how to help Melissa improve her performance. Tutors were hired, rewards were promised, and excuses were manufactured to explain away her sister's academic struggles. The most telling incident occurred during Victoria's senior year. She had been selected as valedictorian, an honor that came with a significant scholarship opportunity. The ceremony was scheduled for the same evening as Melissa's spring dance, where she was nominated for court. When Melissa discovered the conflict, she immediately declared she couldn't possibly attend her dance without family support. Their parents faced a choice between celebrating their daughter's academic achievement and supporting their other daughter's social aspiration. The decision was swift and predictable. They would attend Melissa's dance, leaving Victoria to deliver her valedictorian speech to an audience that wouldn't include her immediate family. Victoria delivered her address about perseverance and determination to a crowd that included her classmates' proud parents, teachers who had mentored her, and the conspicuous empty seats where her family should have been. After the ceremony, she found 17 missed calls and dozens of texts from her parents and sister, all posted from the dance, showing Melissa's disappointment at not winning dance court, mixed with belated congratulations for Victoria's speech. The message was clear and consistent. Melissa's emotions took precedence over Victoria's achievements. College provided temporary escape from this dynamic. Victoria threw herself into her studies at Berkeley, majoring in political science with a minor in business law. She worked multiple part-time jobs to supplement her scholarships, determined to minimize the financial burden on her family. During breaks, she would return home to find that Melissa had claimed Victoria's childhood bedroom for various projects, leaving Victoria to sleep on the living room couch in what had been her own home. Melissa's college experience followed a different trajectory. She started at 3 different institutions, never completing more than 2 semesters anywhere before deciding the environment wasn't right for her creative spirit. Each departure was accompanied by lengthy family discussions about finding the perfect fit for Melissa's unique talents, while the mounting tuition costs strained the family's finances. Victoria graduated summa cum laude and immediately entered law school, again on scholarships earned through merit and maintained through relentless dedication. Melissa moved back home after her latest educational abandonment, spending her days developing her social media presence and her evenings complaining about feeling lost and unsupported. The family dinners during Victoria's law school breaks became exercises in emotional management. Melissa would dominate conversations with her latest crisis or inspiration, while Victoria was expected to listen supportively and offer encouragement. Any attempt Victoria made to share her own law school experiences was met with glazed expressions from her parents, who would quickly redirect attention back to Melissa's more immediately dramatic concerns. During her final year of law school, Victoria began dating Michael Torres, a fellow student who shared her work ethic and ambition. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared goals rather than dramatic passion. When Victoria brought Michael home for dinner, her parents were polite but distant, asking few questions about his background or plans. 2 months later, Melissa announced she had started dating someone special. Derek Matthews was a local musician with no steady income and a casual relationship with responsibility, but he possessed the kind of charismatic charm that Melissa found irresistible. When she brought Derek home, their parents welcomed him with open arms, asking detailed questions about his music and expressing genuine interest in his artistic pursuits. The contrast wasn't lost on Victoria. Michael, who was about to graduate law school and had already secured a position at a respected firm, was treated with polite indifference. Derek, who lived paycheck to paycheck and had never held a job for more than 6 months, was embraced as a potential son-in-law. Victoria passed the California bar exam on her first attempt and began working as an associate at Henderson & Associates, specializing in family law. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days helping other people navigate complicated family dynamics while struggling to understand her own. Her career progressed steadily. Victoria proved herself to be a meticulous researcher and persuasive advocate, quickly earning the respect of partners and clients alike. She worked long hours, building a reputation for thoroughness and reliability. Her parents acknowledged her professional success with the same brief acknowledgement they had always given her achievements, usually followed immediately by updates about Melissa's latest ventures. Melissa, meanwhile, had cycled through various endeavors. She tried photography, then jewelry making, then life coaching, never quite finding the perfect outlet for her creativity. Each new pursuit was met with enthusiastic family support and financial backing from their parents, who continued to believe that the right opportunity would unlock Melissa's potential. Victoria graduated summa cum laude and immediately entered law school, again on scholarships earned through merit and maintained through relentless dedication. Melissa moved back home after her latest educational abandonment, spending her days developing her social media presence and her evenings complaining about feeling lost and unsupported. The family dinners during Victoria's law school breaks became exercises in emotional management. Melissa would dominate conversations with her latest crisis or inspiration, while Victoria was expected to listen supportively and offer encouragement. Any attempt Victoria made to share her own law school experiences was met with glazed expressions from her parents, who would quickly redirect attention back to Melissa's more immediately dramatic concerns. During her final year of law school, Victoria began dating Michael Torres, a fellow student who shared her work ethic and ambition. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared goals rather than dramatic passion. When Victoria brought Michael home for dinner, her parents were polite but distant, asking few questions about his background or plans. 2 months later, Melissa announced she had started dating someone special. Derek Matthews was a local musician with no steady income and a casual relationship with responsibility, but he possessed the kind of charismatic charm that Melissa found irresistible. When she brought Derek home, their parents welcomed him with open arms, asking detailed questions about his music and expressing genuine interest in his artistic pursuits. The contrast wasn't lost on Victoria. Michael, who was about to graduate law school and had already secured a position at a respected firm, was treated with polite indifference. Derek, who lived paycheck to paycheck and had never held a job for more than 6 months, was embraced as a potential son-in-law. Victoria passed the California bar exam on her first attempt and began working as an associate at Henderson & Associates, specializing in family law. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days helping other people navigate complicated family dynamics while struggling to understand her own. Her career progressed steadily. Victoria proved herself to be a meticulous researcher and persuasive advocate, quickly earning the respect of partners and clients alike. She worked long hours, building a reputation for thoroughness and reliability. Her parents acknowledged her professional success with the same brief recognition they had always given her achievements, usually followed immediately by updates about Melissa's latest ventures. Melissa, meanwhile, had cycled through various endeavors.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
3 years into her legal career, Victoria received a promotion to senior associate, bringing with it a substantial salary increase and the opportunity to take on more complex cases. That same week, Melissa announced that she and Derek were engaged after a whirlwind romance that had lasted exactly 14 months. The family celebration was immediate and elaborate. Their parents began planning an engagement party, discussing wedding venues, and expressing tearful joy at the prospect of their baby girl finding her soulmate. Victoria's promotion was mentioned briefly in passing, acknowledged with a quick hug before attention returned to wedding discussions. The engagement party was held at their parents' house, decorated with string lights and filled with Melissa's friends and Derek's musician colleagues. Victoria attended dutifully, watching her sister bask in the attention while fielding questions about when she and Michael might follow suit. The implication was clear. Despite her professional success and stable relationship, Victoria was somehow behind in life's important milestones. Michael proposed 6 months later, presenting a ring he had saved for over a year to purchase. The proposal was thoughtful and private, taking place during a quiet dinner at their favorite restaurant. Victoria said yes with tears of joy, overwhelmed by the certainty that she had found her life partner. When she called her parents to share the news, their response was notably muted. "How wonderful, honey," her mother said, her voice carrying undertones of distraction. "Have you set a date? Melissa's wedding is in 18 months, so you'll want to make sure there's no conflict." The assumption that Victoria's wedding should be scheduled around Melissa's timeline was delivered without conscious thought, a reflexive prioritization that had shaped 30 years of family decisions. Victoria felt the familiar sting of being an afterthought in her own family, but she had learned to manage these disappointments without confrontation. She and Michael began planning a modest ceremony, intending to keep costs reasonable and focus on the celebration rather than elaborate details. Victoria had always imagined wearing her grandmother's wedding dress, a beautiful silk creation that had been worn by her grandmother in 1952, her mother in 1975, and preserved carefully for the next generation. The dress was stored in her parents' cedar closet, wrapped in acid-free tissue and mothballs. Victoria remembered her mother showing it to her as a child, explaining how important it was to preserve family traditions and pass them down through generations. The dress represented continuity, heritage, and the expectation that Victoria would someday contribute her own chapter to the family story. When Victoria mentioned her intention to wear the dress, her mother's response was supportive but contained a subtle caveat. "Of course, dear, that's what we always planned. Just remember that Melissa might want to wear it too for her wedding. Maybe you could work something out together." The suggestion that Victoria should negotiate with her sister for the right to wear their grandmother's dress was breathtaking in its casual dismissal of tradition and precedence. As the older daughter, Victoria had always assumed she would wear the dress first, with Melissa having the opportunity afterward. The implication that this should be subject to discussion revealed how completely their parents had abandoned normal family hierarchies in favor of Melissa's preferences. Victoria chose not to address the comment directly, instead focusing on her wedding planning and career responsibilities. She was handling several complex cases, including a particularly challenging custody dispute that required extensive research and emotional investment. Her work provided a welcome distraction from family dynamics and a source of genuine satisfaction. Meanwhile, Melissa's wedding preparations consumed increasing amounts of family time and resources. Every Sunday dinner became a planning session, with discussions of flowers, venues, catering, and guest lists. Melissa had decided on an elaborate celebration with over 200 guests, despite the fact that she and Derek had minimal income to contribute to the costs. Their parents were stretching their finances to fund Melissa's dream wedding, remortgaging their house to cover expenses that continued to escalate as Melissa discovered new must-have elements for her special day. The financial strain was evident, but never acknowledged directly. Instead, their parents spoke in glowing terms about giving their daughter the wedding she deserved. Victoria offered to contribute to wedding costs, suggesting that both daughters could help ease the burden on their parents. Her offer was politely declined with the explanation that Melissa's wedding was the parents' gift to their daughter, while Victoria, being financially successful, could afford to pay for her own celebration. The double standard was stunning in its clarity. Melissa, whose only income came from sporadic freelance projects and Derek's unpredictable music gigs, was entitled to parental financial support for her wedding. Victoria, who had worked continuously since age 16 and now earned a substantial salary, was expected to fund her own celebration without assistance. As Melissa's wedding date approached, the family's attention focused entirely on ensuring every detail met her exacting standards. Victoria continued planning her own ceremony, scheduled for 4 months after Melissa's, with minimal family input or involvement. She researched venues, interviewed photographers, and selected flowers, while her parents remained absorbed in Melissa's more pressing needs. The assumption that Victoria's independence meant she required no support or involvement had become so ingrained that her parents seemed genuinely surprised when she mentioned feeling excluded from family planning discussions. Their response was to insist they were available if she needed help, missing the point that she shouldn't have to request basic parental interest in her major life events. 2 weeks before Melissa's wedding, Victoria finally scheduled an appointment to try on their grandmother's dress. She had been putting off the fitting, partly due to work demands and partly due to an inexplicable reluctance to make the dress selection feel final. Some instinct warned her that claiming the dress might trigger conflict she wasn't prepared to handle. Her instincts proved correct. When Victoria mentioned the scheduled fitting during Sunday dinner, Melissa's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "What dress fitting?" she asked, her voice carrying dangerous undertones. Their mother looked uncomfortable, glancing between her daughters with the expression of someone who had hoped to avoid this exact conversation. "Victoria mentioned wanting to wear Grandma's dress for her wedding," she said carefully. Melissa's face transformed through a series of expressions: surprise, hurt, anger, and finally determination. "But I assumed I would wear it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm getting married first. Doesn't that mean I get first choice?" The logic was backwards, but delivered with such conviction that their parents immediately began trying to mediate, rather than pointing out the obvious flaw in Melissa's reasoning. Victoria found herself in the surreal position of having to argue for her right to wear a dress that had been promised to her since childhood. "Actually," Victoria said calmly, "traditionally, the oldest daughter wears the family dress first, then it's passed down. That's how it worked with Mom and Grandma." Melissa's eyes filled with tears, a response that had proven effective in family negotiations for decades. "But my wedding is in 2 weeks," she protested. "All my plans are already made. Victoria has months to find something else." The manipulation was transparent but effective. Their parents exchanged the look that Victoria had learned to recognize as the prelude to her disappointment. They were about to choose Melissa's immediate emotional needs over established family tradition and Victoria's legitimate claim. "Maybe you girls could work out a compromise," their father suggested weakly. "Melissa's wedding is so soon, and Victoria has more time to make alternative arrangements." Victoria felt a familiar coldness settle in her chest, the emotional numbness that protected her from the full impact of yet another betrayal. "There's no compromise to be made," she said quietly. "It's our grandmother's dress. I'm the older daughter. This is how family traditions work." But even as she spoke, Victoria could see the decision forming in her parents' expressions. Melissa's tears were flowing freely now, her distress at potentially losing the dress genuine and heartbreaking to parents who had spent decades prioritizing her emotional comfort over fairness or logic. The conversation continued for another hour, with various proposals floated and rejected. Could they alter the dress to fit both daughters? Could Victoria wear it for the ceremony and let Melissa wear it for photos? Could they have a replica made? Each suggestion missed the fundamental point that Victoria had every right to wear the dress without negotiation or compromise. The fact that her family was treating her legitimate claim as a selfish demand revealed how completely they had abandoned normal boundaries in their management of Melissa's emotions. Finally, exhausted by the circular discussion and recognizing the futility of arguing against decades of established family dynamics, Victoria made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "Fine," she said, standing up from the dinner table. "Let Melissa wear the dress. I'll find something else." The relief on her parents' faces was immediate and unmistakable. Melissa's tears stopped as if controlled by a switch, replaced by a brilliant smile and effusive thanks. Victoria was praised for her generosity and maturity, qualities that apparently made her the ideal candidate for sacrifice. That night, Victoria called Michael and explained the situation. His response was swift and angry. "That's completely insane. It's your family's dress. You're the older daughter. How is this even a discussion?" His outrage on her behalf was validating, but also highlighted how isolated Victoria had become in her acceptance of unfair treatment. To an outsider, her family's decision was obviously wrong. To Victoria, it was just another example of the pattern that had shaped her entire life. She spent the following days researching alternative wedding dresses, trying to find something that would honor her grandmother's memory without directly competing with family tradition. The process was emotionally exhausting, transforming what should have been a joyful experience into another reminder of her secondary status in her own family. Melissa's wedding proceeded without incident, a lavish celebration that strained her parents' finances but fulfilled her vision of the perfect day. Victoria attended dutifully, watching her sister wear their grandmother's dress down the aisle while feeling like a guest at her own family's gathering. During the reception, several relatives approached Victoria to comment on how beautiful Melissa looked in the family dress, completely unaware of the conflict that had preceded this decision. Victoria smiled and agreed, maintaining the facade that everything was normal, while internally noting each instance of praise directed toward her sister for wearing what should have been Victoria's dress. The photographs from Melissa's wedding would forever document her in the family heirloom, creating a visual record that would make Victoria's eventual use of the dress seem like the second choice, the backup option, rather than the intended inheritance. After the wedding, Victoria threw herself into planning her own ceremony with renewed determination. She found a beautiful vintage-inspired dress that honored the spirit of her grandmother's gown while establishing her independence from family traditions that no longer served her interests. Her wedding preparations proceeded with minimal family involvement, a situation that suited Victoria's growing emotional distance from her parents and sister. She was learning to protect herself by reducing expectations and relying more heavily on Michael's family and their chosen circle of friends. 3 months before her wedding, Victoria was working late at her law office when she received a frantic call from her mother. Melissa was in crisis again, this time because her marriage to Derek was struggling under the weight of financial pressure and incompatible life goals. The fairy tale wedding had been followed by the harsh reality of two people with no practical skills trying to build a sustainable life together. "Could you talk to her?" Patricia pleaded. "She respects your advice about practical matters. Maybe you could help her figure out how to make the marriage work." Victoria agreed to meet with Melissa, partly out of family obligation and partly out of genuine concern for her sister's well-being. They met at a coffee shop near Victoria's office, where Melissa poured out her frustrations about Derek's lack of ambition and their mounting debts. "I thought marriage would make everything perfect," Melissa confessed, tears streaming down her face. "But Derek won't look for steady work, and we can barely pay rent. I don't know what to do." Victoria listened patiently and offered practical advice about budgeting, career planning, and communication strategies. She suggested marriage counseling and provided referrals to financial advisors who could help them develop sustainable spending habits. Melissa seemed grateful for the guidance, thanking Victoria for being understanding and supportive. For a moment, Victoria allowed herself to hope that crisis might finally bring them closer together as adults rather than competitors for parental attention. This hope was short-lived. 2 days after their heart-to-heart conversation, Victoria discovered that Melissa had used their discussion as evidence of Victoria's interference in her marriage. She had told their parents that Victoria was being judgmental and unsupportive, criticizing Darrett and making Melissa feel worse about her situation. The phone call from their mother was swift and accusatory. "Victoria, Melissa says you were very harsh with her about Derek. You know how fragile she is right now. Couldn't you have been more encouraging?" The betrayal was breathtaking in its casualness. Melissa had sought Victoria's help, received genuine support and practical advice, then immediately reframed the interaction as an attack to garner sympathy from their parents. Victoria realized that her sister's request for help had been less about receiving guidance and more about creating another opportunity to position herself as the wrongs party. This incident crystallized something important for Victoria. She had spent 30 years trying to maintain relationships with family members who consistently distorted her actions and intentions to serve their own emotional needs. No amount of patience, support, or sacrifice would ever be enough to satisfy their demands while preserving her own dignity and well-being. As her wedding date approached, Victoria found herself simultaneously excited about marrying Michael and dreading the family dynamics that would inevitably surface during the celebration. She had learned to manage her expectations, but the prospect of another event where her needs would be secondary to managing Melissa's emotions was emotionally exhausting. 2 weeks before the wedding, Victoria was working in her home office when she heard her apartment door open. She had given her parents a spare key for emergencies, assuming they would respect the privacy of her personal space. The assumption proved naive. Victoria emerged from her office to find Melissa in her living room, holding a large garment bag with a sheepish expression on her face. "I hope you don't mind," Melissa said with forced brightness. "Mom gave me your key. I wanted to surprise you." The surprise was significant, but not in the way Melissa had intended. Inside the garment bag was their grandmother's wedding dress, now bearing signs of obvious wear and several small stains from Melissa's wedding reception. More disturbing were the alterations that had been made to accommodate Melissa's different body type, changes that appeared irreversible. "I thought you might want to wear it after all," Melissa said, her voice carrying undertones of manufactured generosity. "I know how much family tradition means to you." Victoria stared at the damaged dress, understanding immediately what had happened. Melissa had worn the gown for her own wedding, allowed it to be stained and altered, and was now offering it back as if this were a gift rather than an insult. The casual cruelty of the gesture was stunning. Melissa had taken something irreplaceable, damaged it through carelessness, and was now expecting gratitude for returning the ruins. The dress that had been preserved carefully for decades was now a shadow of its former beauty, bearing permanent reminders of someone else's celebration. "Thank you," Victoria said calmly, accepting the garment bag. "That's very thoughtful." Melissa beamed, apparently satisfied that her gesture had been received as intended. She stayed for coffee, chatting about her marriage troubles and her latest career ideas, while Victoria processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. After Melissa left, Victoria carefully examined the dress. The silk had several red wine stains that had set permanently. The beading was damaged in multiple places. Most significantly, the dress had been hemmed and taken in at the waist in ways that couldn't be undone without extensive reconstruction. Victoria sat in her living room, holding the remnants of 4 generations of family tradition, and made a decision that would change everything. She would not wear this dress to her wedding. She would not pretend to be grateful for receiving damaged goods. And she would not continue accepting treatment that no rational person would consider acceptable. The following morning, Victoria called her parents to discuss the dress situation. She explained the damage and alterations, expecting them to share her dismay of a family heirloom. Their response was predictable, but still shocking in its dismissal of her legitimate concerns. "Dresses are meant to be worn," her mother said dismissively. "At least Melissa thought to offer it to you. That shows how much she cares about including you in family traditions." The reframing of destruction as generosity was typical of her family's approach to Melissa's behavior. No action was too thoughtless or selfish to be spun as evidence of Melissa's good intentions and Victoria's unreasonable expectations. Victoria ended the call without arguing, recognizing the futility of expecting different responses from people who had spent decades perfecting these patterns of denial and rationalization. Instead, she began documenting the damage to the dress, photographing each stain and alteration with the methodical precision she brought to legal cases. Something was shifting in Victoria's understanding of her situation. For 30 years, she had accepted her family's treatment as unfortunate but unchangeable. Now, looking at the evidence of their casual disregard for her feelings and rights, she began to consider alternative approaches to family relationships. One week before her wedding, Victoria was in her office reviewing case files when her assistant announced that Melissa was in the waiting area. Victoria reluctantly agreed to see her sister, assuming this was another crisis requiring her intervention or support. Melissa entered Victoria's office with the kind of dramatic flair she had perfected over decades of demanding attention. Her eyes were red from crying, her hands shaking as she clutched a tissue box. "I need your help," Melissa announced without preamble. "Derek left me. He said I'm too high maintenance and financially irresponsible. I have nowhere to go." Victoria listened as Melissa detailed her marital collapse, which had occurred exactly as Victoria had predicted, based on their earlier conversation. Derek had finally grown tired of supporting someone who expected others to solve her problems without taking responsibility for creating solutions. "I was hoping I could stay with you and Michael for a while," Melissa continued, "just until I get back on my feet. I know you have that spare bedroom, and it would mean so much to have family support during this difficult time." The request was breathtaking in its presumption. Melissa wanted to move into Victoria's home 1 week before her wedding, bringing her emotional drama and financial problems into what should have been a peaceful preparation period for the most important day of Victoria's life. "That won't work," Victoria said firmly. "We have wedding preparations this week, and Michael's parents are staying in the spare room." Melissa's face crumpled with disappointment and hurt. "I can't believe you're turning me away when I need you most," she sobbed. "I thought family was supposed to support each other." The irony of Melissa lecturing Victoria about family support was extraordinary, but Victoria had learned not to expect logical consistency from her sister. Instead, she offered practical alternatives: contact information for temporary housing resources, recommendations for divorce attorneys, and suggestions for employment opportunities. None of these practical solutions interested Melissa, who had clearly expected emotional support and financial assistance rather than actual problem-solving tools. The meeting ended with Melissa declaring herself hurt and disappointed by Victoria's lack of sisterly compassion. That evening, Victoria received angry phone calls from both parents, accusing her of heartlessness for refusing to help Melissa during her time of need. The fact that Victoria was in the middle of her own major life event seemed irrelevant to their calculation of family obligations. "She's your sister," their mother repeated, as if blood relations automatically created unlimited responsibility for another adult's poor decisions. "How can you be so cold when she needs help?" Victoria found herself explaining again that she had offered substantial practical help, including legal referrals and employment resources. What she couldn't provide was housing and emotional management services during her wedding week. The conversation ended with their mother expressing disappointment in Victoria's selfishness and wondering aloud where they had gone wrong in raising such an uncompromising daughter. The accusation stung, not because it was accurate, but because it revealed how completely her parents misunderstood her situation. Victoria spent her final pre-wedding week managing the fallout from refusing to accommodate Melissa's latest crisis. Instead of focusing on her upcoming marriage, she found herself defending her reasonable boundaries against family members who had never learned to accept limits on their emotional demands. The pattern was exhaustingly familiar, but also clarifying. Victoria realized that no amount of accommodation would ever satisfy her family's expectations. There would always be another crisis, another emergency, another situation where her needs would be deemed less important than managing Melissa's emotions. As she prepared for her wedding day, Victoria made peace with the likelihood that her family would find ways to make the celebration about their disappointment rather than her happiness. She had learned to protect her joy by reducing her expectations, but the necessity of this protection felt like a form of grief for the family relationships she had always hoped might be possible. Victoria's wedding day arrived under overcast skies that matched her complicated emotions about the family dynamics surrounding her celebration. She had chosen a beautiful vintage-inspired gown that honored her personal style rather than family expectations, but the absence of her grandmother's dress felt like a phantom limb throughout the morning preparations. Michael's family had arrived early to help with final arrangements, their genuine enthusiasm and practical support creating a stark contrast to her own family's distracted participation. His mother Maria had taken charge of flower arrangements when Victoria's mother became overwhelmed managing Melissa's latest emotional crisis. His father Carlos quietly handled vendor coordination when Victoria's father disappeared for lengthy phone calls with Melissa about her housing situation. The ceremony itself proceeded beautifully despite the undercurrent of family tension. Victoria walked down the aisle to Michael's beaming face, surrounded by friends and colleagues who had gathered to celebrate their union. Her parents attended but seemed preoccupied, their attention divided between the wedding ceremony and whispered conversations about Melissa's absence. Melissa had declared herself too emotionally devastated by her divorce to attend Victoria's wedding, a decision that their parents accepted without question despite the obvious manipulation. The message was clear: Melissa's emotional comfort took precedence over participating in her sister's major life milestone. During the reception, Victoria found herself fielding questions from relatives about Melissa's whereabouts while managing her disappointment at her sister's calculated absence. The explanations became increasingly strained as she tried to maintain family loyalty while acknowledging the obvious slight. Her Aunt Rebecca, their father's sister, approached Victoria during the dinner service with an expression of barely contained frustration. "Where exactly is Melissa tonight?" she asked directly. "I find it hard to believe she couldn't manage to attend her own sister's wedding." Victoria offered the rehearsed explanation about Melissa's difficult divorce and emotional fragility, but Rebecca's expression remained skeptical. "Honey, I've watched this pattern for 30 years. That girl has made everything about herself since she could walk, and your parents have enabled every bit of it." The blunt assessment from a family member was both validating and uncomfortable. Victoria had spent years making excuses for her family's behavior, but hearing it characterized so directly by someone who had observed the patterns from the outside forced her to confront the reality she had been avoiding. "She's having a hard time right now," Victoria said weakly, the defense sounding hollow even to her own ears. Rebecca shook her head. "There's always something with Melissa. Meanwhile, you've been taking care of yourself and everyone else for decades without expecting the world to stop for your problems." The conversation was interrupted by Victoria's mother approaching with updates about Melissa's latest crisis. Apparently, Derek had returned to retrieve his belongings from their apartment, leading to a dramatic confrontation that required immediate family intervention. Patricia was considering leaving the reception early to provide support. Victoria stared at her mother, processing the casual assumption that Melissa's manufactured drama was more important than celebrating her daughter's wedding. The incident with Derek's belongings was entirely predictable and hardly constituted an emergency requiring parental intervention. "It's my wedding day," said quietly, the words carrying more weight than their simple meaning. Patricia looked surprised by the gentle pushback. "Of course, darling, I'm not leaving. I just think someone should check on Melissa to make sure she's safe." The implication that Victoria should be concerned about her sister's well-being during her own wedding reception was typical of the family's expectation that she would prioritize Melissa's needs over her own happiness. The pattern had become so ingrained that her mother seemed genuinely surprised by Victoria's reluctance to engage with the crisis. Michael appeared beside Victoria, having observed the conversation with growing irritation. "Patricia, with all due respect, today is about Victoria and our marriage. Melissa is an adult who needs to handle her own problems."
The directness of his statement clearly startled Patricia, who was unaccustomed to anyone setting boundaries around Melissa's emotional demands. She mumbled something about family obligations and drifted away, leaving Victoria grateful for Michael's intervention, but also aware that the confrontation had created new tension. The remainder of the reception passed without major incident, though Victoria noticed her parents spending considerable time on their phones, presumably managing Melissa's various needs from a distance. Their distraction was evident to other guests, many of whom commented on the unusual dynamic. Victoria's college roommate Jennifer approached during the cake cutting with characteristic bluntness. "I hate to say this on your wedding day, but your parents seem completely checked out of your celebration." The observation stung because it was accurate. Victoria's parents were physically present but emotionally absent, their attention consumed by their other daughter's manufactured crisis rather than participating fully in this milestone moment. As the evening wound down, Victoria overheard her father making plans to drive to Melissa's apartment after the reception to help her deal with Derek's belongings. The casual assumption that they would leave their daughter's wedding celebration to manage another adult's predictable drama was breathtaking in its callousness. Victoria and Michael left for their honeymoon the following morning, grateful to escape the family dynamics for 2 weeks in Italy.
The time away provided perspective on just how abnormal her family's behavior had become and how much energy she had been spending on managing their dysfunction rather than building her own life. When they returned, Victoria threw herself into her legal practice with renewed focus. She had been promoted to partner track at Henderson & Associates, a significant achievement that required increased dedication to client development and case management. The demanding schedule provided welcome distance from family obligations while advancing her professional goals. 3 months after the wedding, Victoria received a call that would change everything. Melissa had been arrested for fraud, charged with writing bad checks and using credit cards that belonged to their parents without permission. The financial crimes had been ongoing for months, funding Melissa's lifestyle while she claimed to be looking for employment. Their parents discovered the theft when their bank contacted them about overdraft fees and suspicious activity on accounts that should have been dormant. The investigation revealed that Melissa had been systematically stealing from them since her divorce, using their financial information to support herself while claiming destitution. Victoria's first emotion was not surprise, but a grim satisfaction that Melissa's behavior had finally produced consequences that couldn't be managed through emotional manipulation. The criminal charges were serious enough to require actual legal intervention rather than family problem-solving sessions. Her second emotion was professional concern for her parents, who were facing significant financial losses at a time when they should have been enjoying stable retirement. Melissa's theft had depleted their savings and created debt that would take years to resolve. When Patricia called Victoria in tears, begging her to use her legal expertise to help Melissa avoid prosecution, Victoria felt a familiar crossroads approaching. She could step in to manage another of Melissa's crises, using her professional skills to minimize consequences for someone who had never faced accountability for her actions. Or she could maintain appropriate boundaries and allow the legal system to function as intended. "I can't represent Melissa," Victoria said clearly. "It would be a conflict of interest, and she needs to take responsibility for her choices." The response was met with accusations of heartlessness and family abandonment. Patricia couldn't understand why Victoria wouldn't use her connections and expertise to help her sister avoid the consequences of criminal behavior. "She made a mistake," Patricia pleaded. "You know how desperate she's been since the divorce. She wasn't thinking clearly." Victoria found herself explaining basic concepts of accountability to her mother, pointing out that theft was not a mistake, but a deliberate choice made repeatedly over months. Melissa had systematically violated her parents' trust and financial security, crimes that deserved prosecution regardless of her emotional state. The conversation ended with Patricia declaring herself disappointed in Victoria's refusal to help family in crisis, a familiar refrain that had lost its power to manipulate. Victoria had finally reached a point where her mother's disappointment was less important than maintaining her professional integrity and personal boundaries.
Melissa's legal troubles dominated family conversations for months. She hired a defense attorney using money borrowed from extended relatives, all while maintaining her innocence and blaming her actions on emotional distress from the divorce. The familiar pattern of deflecting responsibility continued even as criminal charges proceeded through the court system. Victoria maintained strict boundaries around involvement in Melissa's case, referring her parents to appropriate resources while refusing to provide legal advice or professional intervention. The decision created ongoing tension with her parents, who couldn't understand why she wouldn't use her expertise to help family. 6 months after Melissa's arrest, Victoria was working late at her office when she received an urgent call from her building's security guard. Someone had been attempting to enter her office after hours, claiming to be her sister and demanding access to files that could help with a legal case. Victoria immediately drove to her office, where she found Melissa in the lobby arguing with security guards about her right to access her sister's workspace. The scene was both pathetic and infuriating, revealing the depth of Melissa's desperation and her continued belief that Victoria's resources were available for her use. "What are you doing here?" Victoria demanded, her professional composure strained by the surreal situation. Melissa's appearance was disheveled, her usual polished presentation replaced with obvious signs of stress and financial hardship. "I need your help," she said desperately. "The prosecutor is offering a plea deal, but my lawyer says I might still go to jail. You have connections. You could talk to people." The assumption that Victoria should use her professional relationships to interfere with a criminal case was stunning in its ethical blindness. Melissa genuinely believed that family connections should override legal process and that Victoria's career existed primarily to serve her needs. "I've told you repeatedly that I cannot and will not get involved in your case," Victoria said firmly. "You need to work with your attorney and accept responsibility for your actions." Melissa's facade of desperation cracked, revealing the familiar anger that emerged whenever she couldn't manipulate situations to her advantage. "You're enjoying this," she accused. "You've always been jealous of me, and now you're punishing me for being the favorite." The accusation was so divorced from reality that Victoria almost laughed. Melissa had stolen thousands of dollars from their parents, been arrested for fraud, and was facing potential jail time, yet she still managed to frame herself as the victim of Victoria's supposed jealousy. Security escorted Melissa from the building after she refused to leave voluntarily, but not before she created a scene that Victoria knew would be discussed among her colleagues for weeks. The professional embarrassment was significant, but more troubling was the realization that Melissa felt entitled to disrupt Victoria's workplace when her manipulations failed to produce desired results. The following morning, Victoria received calls from both parents demanding explanations for her treatment of Melissa during the office incident. Somehow, Melissa's attempted break-in had been reframed as Victoria's cruel refusal to help her desperate sister, a narrative inversion that demonstrated the family's complete inability to assign appropriate responsibility for actions and consequences. Victoria found herself explaining to her parents that their daughter had attempted to access confidential legal files and had been removed by security for trespassing. The facts of the situation were clear, but their emotional investment in protecting Melissa from consequences made them unable to process the information objectively. "She's facing prison time," their father said, as if this fact alone should override all other considerations. "Surely you can do something to help her." The conversation revealed how completely her parents misunderstood both Victoria's professional obligations and the seriousness of Melissa's crimes. They seemed to believe that family loyalty should trump legal ethics, and that Victoria's success created obligations to solve problems that Melissa had created for herself. 2 weeks later, Victoria was reviewing case files in her home office when she heard familiar voices in her hallway. She had changed the locks after giving her parents the spare key, but apparently they had made copies before returning the original. The casual violation of her privacy was characteristic of their approach to boundaries. Victoria emerged from her office to find her parents and Melissa in her living room, apparently conducting a family intervention about her lack of support during the legal crisis. The presumption of entering her home uninvited for the purpose of pressuring her to compromise her professional ethics was breathtaking in its inappropriateness. "We need to talk," Patricia announced, as if Victoria's consent to this invasion was unnecessary. "Melissa's plea hearing is next week, and she needs character references from family members."
The assumption that Victoria would provide positive character testimony for someone who had committed crimes against their parents demonstrated how completely her family had abandoned any connection between actions and consequences. They expected her to lie under oath to protect Melissa from accountability. "You need to leave," Victoria said calmly, moving toward her phone to call security if necessary. "You don't have permission to be in my home, and I've made my position clear about involvement in Melissa's case." Melissa began crying, a familiar tactic that had proven effective in family negotiations for decades. "I could go to prison," she sobbed. "Don't you care what happens to your own sister?" Victoria looked at Melissa with new clarity, seeing not the sister she had spent 30 years trying to please, but a manipulative adult who had never learned to take responsibility for her choices. The tears were real, but they were tears of self-pity rather than genuine remorse. "I care enough to want you to face the consequences of your actions," Victoria replied. "That's how people learn and grow." The response was met with shocked silence from her parents, who had never heard Victoria speak so directly about Melissa's behavior. They were accustomed to her diplomatic management of family conflicts, not direct confrontation of uncomfortable truths. Her father attempted to restore familiar dynamics by appealing to Victoria's sense of family obligation. "We've always been there for each other," he said weakly. "This is when family support matters most." Victoria felt 30 years of accumulated frustration crystallizing into perfect clarity. "When exactly were you there for me?" she asked quietly. "When you missed my graduation for Melissa's dance? When you chose her wedding over my surgery? When you gave her my grandmother's dress and expected gratitude when she returned it damaged?" The recitation of grievances hung in the air like indictments, each item representing years of suppressed resentment about treatment that no reasonable person would consider acceptable. Her parents looked genuinely surprised by the catalog of complaints, as if they had never considered the cumulative impact of their choices. "Those were different situations," Patricia protested weakly. "We did what we thought was best for everyone." Victoria shook her head. "You did what was easiest for managing Melissa's emotions. There's a difference." The conversation continued for another hour, with various attempts at guilt, manipulation, and emotional blackmail. Victoria remained firm in her boundaries, while her family cycled through their usual tactics for overriding her autonomy. Eventually, they left with threats about reconsidering their relationship with a daughter who had abandoned family values. The ultimatum was familiar, but no longer effective. Victoria had finally reached a point where her parents' approval was less important than her own integrity and peace of mind. The realization was both liberating and sad, representing the end of hope for relationships that had never actually existed in healthy forms. Melissa's plea hearing proceeded without Victoria's participation. She received updates through professional networks rather than family communications, learning that her sister had accepted a plea bargain that included restitution payments and probation rather than jail time. The outcome was probably fair given the circumstances, though Victoria suspected that Melissa's tearful performance and claims of emotional distress had influenced the relatively lenient sentence. The pattern of avoiding serious consequences through emotional manipulation continued even within the legal system. 3 months later, Victoria received a certified letter that changed her understanding of the situation completely. The letter was from an attorney representing Derek, Melissa's ex-husband, informing her that Melissa had been using Victoria's identity and professional reputation to secure credit and establish financial accounts during her marriage. The identity theft was extensive and sophisticated, involving forged documents and false claims about Victoria's income and assets. Derek had discovered the fraud during divorce proceedings and was now seeking restitution for debts that Melissa had incurred using Victoria's identity. Victoria stared at the legal documents, processing the magnitude of what her sister had done. The fraud wasn't limited to stealing from their parents, but extended to stealing Victoria's identity and professional reputation to finance her lifestyle during marriage.
The irony was extraordinary. While Victoria had been trying to maintain professional boundaries around Melissa's criminal case, her sister had already been using Victoria's identity to commit additional crimes that could have destroyed her legal career if discovered earlier. Victoria immediately contacted her own attorney to begin addressing the identity theft, a process that would require extensive documentation and potential cooperation with law enforcement. The situation was both personally devastating and professionally dangerous, threatening the career that Victoria had built through decades of ethical practice and hard work. When she called her parents to inform them about the identity theft, their response revealed how completely they had lost perspective on normal boundaries between right and wrong behavior. Instead of expressing outrage at Melissa's violation of Victoria's identity and career, they focused on how the discovery might affect Melissa's probation status. "You're not going to report this, are you?" Patricia asked anxiously. "Melissa is finally getting her life together. This could send her back to court." The assumption that Victoria should absorb financial and professional damage to protect Melissa from consequences of additional crimes was the final straw in their relationship. Her parents had become so invested in shielding Melissa from accountability that they couldn't recognize obviously criminal behavior as unacceptable. Victoria spent the following weeks working with law enforcement and her attorney to document the identity theft and begin recovery processes. The investigation revealed that Melissa had been systematically using Victoria's information for over 2 years, creating a complex web of false accounts and fraudulent applications. The financial damage was substantial but manageable given Victoria's professional income. More concerning was the potential impact on her legal standing if clients or colleagues discovered that her identity had been compromised through family criminal activity. During this period, Victoria made a decision that surprised even herself. Rather than continuing to protect Melissa from consequences by handling the matter privately, she decided to pursue full prosecution for the identity theft. The crimes were too serious and extensive to be managed as a family problem. The decision created complete rupture with her parents, who accused Victoria of destroying the family by refusing to forgive and forget Melissa's mistakes. They couldn't understand that identity theft wasn't a mistake, but a deliberate violation that could have destroyed Victoria's career and financial security. Victoria's attorney warned her that pursuing prosecution would likely make family reconciliation impossible, but Victoria had finally reached a point where protecting herself was more important than maintaining relationships with people who consistently prioritized her abuser over her well-being. The second criminal case against Melissa proceeded more quickly than the first, partly because the evidence was extensive, and partly because her previous conviction made plea bargaining less attractive to prosecutors. This time, jail time was a real possibility given the sophisticated nature of the identity theft.
Victoria testified in court about the impact of having her identity stolen by her own sister, a process that was both emotionally difficult and professionally necessary. She maintained her composure while describing the violation of trust and the potential career damage that could have resulted from Melissa's crimes. Melissa's defense attorney attempted to portray the identity theft as a family dispute rather than serious criminal behavior, but the extensive documentation made clear that this was systematic fraud rather than miscommunication between siblings. During her testimony, Melissa stared at Victoria with undisguised hatred, apparently shocked that her sister would prioritize legal justice over family loyalty. The expression revealed how completely Melissa misunderstood the situation, still believing that family relationships should override accountability for criminal behavior. The judge sentenced Melissa to 18 months in prison, followed by extended probation and restitution payments. The sentence was substantial enough to represent real consequences while providing opportunities for rehabilitation if Melissa chose to take advantage of them. Victoria felt no satisfaction watching her sister receive a prison sentence, but she also felt no guilt about pursuing justice for serious crimes. The legal system had functioned as intended, holding someone accountable for choices that had caused real harm to others. Her parents attended the sentencing hearing but avoided contact with Victoria, their loyalties clearly established in favor of the daughter who had committed crimes against both parents and sister. The choice was painful but not surprising given decades of established patterns.
After the hearing, Victoria returned to her office to find a package waiting on her desk. Inside was her grandmother's wedding dress, cleaned and professionally restored to its original condition. The accompanying note was from her Aunt Rebecca, who had retrieved the dress from Melissa's apartment and invested in its restoration as a surprise for Victoria. "This should have been yours from the beginning," the note read. "Some traditions are worth preserving, even when families fail to honor them." Victoria held the restored dress with tears in her eyes, not because she needed it for any future purpose, but because it represented someone finally recognizing that her rights and feelings mattered as much as anyone else's in the family. The dress was beautiful, exactly as it had been when her grandmother wore it decades earlier. The restoration was perfect, erasing all evidence of damage and alteration that had occurred during Melissa's wedding. It was as if the violation had been undone, the tradition restored to its intended state. That evening, Victoria called Michael from her office to share the day's events. His response was characteristically supportive. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. It took courage to prioritize justice over family pressure." The support was meaningful because it came from someone who understood that healthy relationships required boundaries and accountability, rather than unlimited forgiveness for destructive behavior. Michael had never expected Victoria to sacrifice her well-being for the sake of maintaining dysfunctional family dynamics. As Victoria prepared to leave her office that night, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 2 years earlier, she would have absorbed the identity theft privately to protect Melissa from consequences. The change in her response represented growth in understanding her own worth and rights. The price of this growth had been the loss of relationships with her parents and sister, but Victoria realized that those relationships had never actually existed in healthy forms. She had been trying to maintain connections with people who saw her primarily as a resource to be managed rather than a person deserving respect and consideration. The recognition was sad but also liberating. Victoria could finally stop expending energy on trying to earn love and approval from people who were constitutionally incapable of it. She could focus instead on relationships with people who valued her as she was, rather than as they wanted her to be. 3 months after Melissa began serving her prison sentence, Victoria received an unexpected call from a victims advocate program. Melissa had requested family mediation as part of her rehabilitation program, claiming she wanted to make amends for the harm she had caused. Victoria's initial response was skepticism, given Melissa's long history of manipulating therapeutic processes to avoid accountability. However, the program coordinator explained that this was a structured process designed to benefit victims rather than offenders, with no requirement for forgiveness or reconciliation. After careful consideration, Victoria agreed to participate in the mediation session. She was curious to see whether prison had produced any genuine self-reflection in her sister, or whether this was another attempt at emotional manipulation designed to reduce consequences. The mediation session took place in a sterile conference room at the correctional facility, supervised by trained facilitators who specialized in family crimes. Melissa appeared smaller and more subdued than Victoria remembered, her usual dramatic flair replaced by something that might have been genuine remorse. "I know I hurt you," Melissa began, her voice quieter than Victoria had ever heard it. "I know I've been hurting you for years, but the identity theft was the worst thing I've ever done." Victoria listened without responding, maintaining the emotional distance she had learned was necessary for interactions with her sister. The words sounded sincere, but Victoria had heard similar apologies before, usually followed by requests for help or forgiveness that came with expectations of restored relationships. Melissa continued speaking for nearly an hour, detailing her understanding of the harm she had caused and accepting responsibility for choices she had previously blamed on circumstances or other people. The accountability was more complete than Victoria had ever heard from her sister, suggesting that prison had provided insights that family interventions had failed to produce. When invited to respond, Victoria spoke carefully about the impact of having her identity stolen and her professional reputation threatened by someone she had spent her life trying to help and support. She didn't express forgiveness, but she acknowledged Melissa's apparent growth in understanding the consequences of her actions. The session ended without dramatic reconciliation or renewed family bonds. Instead, it provided closure on a chapter of Victoria's life that had been marked by exploitation and betrayal. Melissa seemed to understand that rebuilding trust would require years of consistent behavior change rather than emotional appeals. As Victoria left the correctional facility, she felt a sense of completion rather than satisfaction. The mediation had confirmed that Melissa was capable of insight and accountability when consequences were serious enough to require it. Whether this growth would continue after her release remained to be seen. The drive home gave Victoria time to reflect on how much her life had changed since she first discovered the damaged wedding dress in her apartment. The woman who accepted that destruction as another family disappointment had evolved into someone who demanded accountability and justice when wronged. The transformation hadn't been easy or without cost. Victoria's relationship with her parents remained severed, and she had no illusions about reconciliation while they continued to prioritize protecting Melissa over acknowledging the harm she had caused. But Victoria had gained something more valuable than family approval: self-respect and the understanding that her rights and well-being mattered as much as anyone else's. The lesson had been expensive, requiring the loss of relationships she had hoped could be salvaged, but the price had been worth paying for her own integrity and peace of mind. Victoria returned to her life with a clarity that had been absent for decades. The mediation session with Melissa had provided closure, but more importantly, it had confirmed Victoria's decision to prioritize her own well-being over maintaining dysfunctional family relationships. The restored wedding dress hung in her closet like a symbol of traditions worth preserving and boundaries worth defending. 6 months after Melissa began serving her sentence, Victoria received a call that would test her resolve in unexpected ways. Derek, Melissa's ex-husband, had been contacted by a documentary filmmaker investigating financial crimes within families. The producer wanted to include Victoria's case as an example of identity theft between siblings and the long-term impact of enabling behavior. The opportunity to share her story publicly was both appealing and terrifying. Victoria had spent her professional career maintaining privacy around family matters, but the chance to help others recognize similar patterns was compelling.
After extensive discussion with Michael and careful consideration of potential professional implications, she agreed to participate. The documentary crew arrived at Victoria's office on a crisp October morning, their equipment transforming her familiar workspace into a studio. The interviewer, Sarah Martinez, was a seasoned journalist who specialized in financial crimes and family dysfunction. Her approach was respectful but direct, focusing on the systemic nature of the abuse rather than sensationalizing personal details. "Can you describe the moment you realized this wasn't normal family behavior?" Sarah asked, cameras rolling. Victoria considered the question carefully. "I think it was when I found my grandmother's wedding dress destroyed, and my mother suggested I should be grateful that Melissa had offered to return it. That's when I understood that my family's definition of normal was completely skewed." The interview continued for 3 hours, covering Victoria's childhood experiences with favoritism, the escalating pattern of enabling, and her eventual decision to pursue criminal charges rather than absorbing the damage privately. Victoria spoke with measured professionalism about events that had caused tremendous personal pain, maintaining composure while acknowledging the emotional impact. When Sarah asked about regrets, Victoria's response surprised even herself. "I don't regret pursuing justice. I regret that it took me 30 years to understand that my rights mattered as much as anyone else's in my family." The documentary aired 8 months later on a major network, presenting Victoria's story alongside similar cases of financial abuse within families. The response was overwhelming, with hundreds of viewers reaching out to share their own experiences of sibling theft and parental enabling. Victoria found herself inadvertently becoming an advocate for people trapped in similar dynamics. She began receiving requests to speak at legal conferences about family financial crimes and the unique challenges of prosecuting relatives for theft and fraud. One particularly moving letter came from a woman in Portland whose sister had been systematically stealing from their elderly parents while positioning herself as their primary caregiver. The writer had been considering reporting the theft but feared family backlash. Victoria's story had given her the courage to contact Adult Protective Services. The recognition that her experience could help others navigate similar situations was gratifying in ways Victoria hadn't anticipated. She had transformed personal trauma into public service, using her legal expertise and lived experience to support people facing impossible choices between family loyalty and justice. Meanwhile, Victoria's career continued to flourish. Her partnership at Henderson & Associates was confirmed, bringing increased responsibilities and higher-profile cases.
Her reputation for ethical practice and thorough preparation attracted clients who needed representation in complex family law matters. One case particularly resonated with her personal experience. Margaret Coleman, a successful physician, sought Victoria's help divorcing her husband, who had been systematically stealing her identity to fund gambling debts. The parallels to Victoria's situation with Melissa were striking, though the perpetrator was a spouse rather than sibling. "I keep thinking I should be able to handle this privately," Margaret confided during their first consultation. "He's my husband. Shouldn't I be able to work this out without involving lawyers and courts?" Victoria recognized the familiar struggle between personal loyalty and self-protection that had characterized her own journey. "Sometimes the people we love make choices that require legal intervention," she replied gently. "Protecting yourself isn't a betrayal of them." The Coleman case became one of Victoria's most successful, resulting in a divorce settlement that held the husband accountable for financial damages while protecting the client's professional reputation. More importantly, it demonstrated that identity theft within intimate relationships required the same legal response as crimes committed by strangers. Victoria's expertise in family financial crimes led to increased recognition within her profession. She was invited to join the California Bar Association's Committee on Identity Theft and speak at continuing education seminars about recognizing and addressing financial abuse within families. The professional growth was personally satisfying, but Victoria's greatest source of happiness remained her marriage to Michael. Their relationship had deepened through the challenges with her family, demonstrating that healthy partnerships could withstand external pressures when both people maintained clear boundaries and mutual respect. They purchased a house in a quiet Sacramento suburb, creating a home environment that reflected their values rather than accommodating dysfunction. The guest room was decorated with care, intended for friends and Michael's family rather than crisis management for relatives who had never learned to solve their own problems. 2 years after Melissa's sentencing, Victoria received a letter from the correctional facility. Melissa was requesting another meeting, claiming she had important information to share about their family's financial situation. Victoria's initial instinct was to decline, but curiosity about what Melissa might have discovered ultimately won. The second meeting took place under similar circumstances to the first, though Melissa appeared more confident and articulate than during their previous encounter. Prison had apparently provided structure and routine that had been absent from her chaotic lifestyle. "I've been thinking about Mom and Dad's financial problems," Melissa began without preamble. "The theft I was convicted for wasn't the first time I took money from them." Victoria listened as Melissa detailed a pattern of financial manipulation that extended back to her teenage years. What their parents had characterized as supporting their struggling daughter had actually enabled systematic theft that had drained their retirement savings and created debt that would impact them for years. "I've been in financial counseling here," Melissa continued. "The counselor helped me understand that I was addicted to spending money I hadn't earned and manipulating people into giving me what I wanted." The admission was more comprehensive than Victoria had expected. Melissa seemed genuinely committed to understanding her behavior rather than simply expressing regret for getting caught. The insights were encouraging, though Victoria remained cautious about accepting dramatic personality changes based on limited prison encounters. "What do you want from me?" Victoria asked directly. Melissa's response was surprisingly humble. "Nothing. I wanted you to know that the pattern was bigger than what I was prosecuted for, and I wanted you to understand that none of this was your fault." The acknowledgement that Victoria bore no responsibility for the family dysfunction was meaningful, representing a level of self-awareness that Melissa had never demonstrated previously. Whether this growth would continue after her release remained to be seen, but the conversation suggested genuine progress. As the meeting concluded, Melissa made one additional request. "Would you consider writing a letter for my parole review? Not recommending early release, just acknowledging that I've been honest about the extent of my crimes." Victoria agreed to consider the request, though she made clear that any letter would focus on Melissa's cooperation in revealing additional financial crimes rather than recommending reduced punishment. The distinction was important, maintaining Victoria's commitment to justice while acknowledging her sister's apparent growth. As the meeting concluded, Melissa made one additional request. "Would you consider writing a letter for my parole review? Not recommending early release, just acknowledging that I've been honest about the extent of my crimes." Victoria agreed to consider the request, though she made clear that any letter would focus on Melissa's cooperation in revealing additional financial crimes rather than recommending reduced punishment. The distinction was important, maintaining Victoria's commitment to justice while acknowledging her sister's apparent growth.
After leaving the correctional facility, Victoria spent considerable time reflecting on whether Melissa's insights were genuine or represented another form of manipulation designed to reduce consequences. Her experience suggested skepticism, but she also recognized that people could change when faced with serious enough consequences. She ultimately wrote a brief letter for Melissa's parole review, focusing specifically on her sister's cooperation in revealing the full extent of financial crimes against their parents. Her experience suggested skepticism, but she also recognized that people could change when faced with serious enough consequences. She ultimately wrote a brief letter for Melissa's parole review, focusing specifically on her sister's cooperation in revealing the full extent of financial crimes against their parents. The letter made no recommendations about early release, but acknowledged Melissa's honesty in detailing previously unknown theft. The parole board denied early release, requiring Melissa to serve her full sentence before beginning supervised probation. Victoria felt this was appropriate, given the extensive nature of the crimes and the need for demonstrated behavior change over time rather than institutional conversations. 3 years after the documentary aired, Victoria was invited to testify before a state legislative committee considering new laws about financial crimes within families. Her expertise had become recognized beyond the legal community, positioning her as an authority on the intersection of family relationships and criminal justice. The testimony was professionally significant, but also personally meaningful, representing the transformation of painful experiences into public service. Victoria spoke about the need for legal protections for family members victimized by financial crimes and the importance of treating domestic theft with the same seriousness as crimes committed by strangers. Family relationships don't excuse criminal behavior, she told the legislators. In fact, crimes committed by family members often cause deeper and longer-lasting harm because they violate trust in the most fundamental relationships. The committee ultimately passed legislation strengthening penalties for identity theft and financial crimes committed against family members, with specific provisions for protecting victims who report relatives for theft. Victoria's testimony was cited as influential in the bill's passage. The legislative success was gratifying, but Victoria's primary focus remained her legal practice and marriage. She had learned to find satisfaction in work that aligned with her values rather than seeking approval from people incapable of providing it healthily. 4 years after Melissa's incarceration, Victoria's parents made their first direct contact since the criminal trials. They requested a meeting to discuss their daughter's upcoming release and potential family reconciliation. Victoria agreed to meet them at a neutral location, curious about what they hoped to accomplish. Her parents had aged significantly, the financial and emotional stress of recent years evident in their appearance. They seemed smaller and more fragile than Victoria remembered, though their fundamental approach to family relationships appeared unchanged. "We're hoping the family can come together when Melissa is released," Patricia began hesitantly. "She's learned so much in prison, and we think this could be a fresh start for everyone." Victoria listened as her parents outlined their hopes for restored family harmony, apparently believing that time and consequences had erased the underlying problems that had created their dysfunction. They spoke about forgiveness and moving forward without acknowledging the systematic enabling that had produced the criminal behavior. "What has changed about how you handle conflict and boundaries?" Victoria asked directly. The question seemed to confuse her parents, who had apparently expected discussions about practical arrangements rather than fundamental relationship dynamics. They spoke vaguely about everyone being older and wiser without demonstrating any understanding of the patterns that had created their family's problems. Victoria realized that her parents remained incapable of recognizing their role in enabling Melissa's destructive behavior. They viewed her criminal convictions as unfortunate events rather than predictable consequences of decades of avoiding accountability. "I'm not interested in returning to previous family dynamics," Victoria said clearly. "If Melissa has genuinely changed and you've learned to maintain appropriate boundaries, relationships might be possible in the future. But I won't participate in pretending that nothing happened or that consequences were unfair." Her parents left the meeting disappointed but not surprised.
They had hoped that Victoria's success and happiness might make her more willing to prioritize family harmony over personal boundaries, but her response demonstrated that prosperity had actually strengthened her resolve to maintain healthy relationships. 6 months later, Melissa was released from prison to a halfway house, beginning the transition back to independent living. Victoria learned about the release through professional networks rather than family communication, maintaining her distance while monitoring the situation. Melissa's first months of freedom were reportedly challenging but stable. She secured employment at a nonprofit organization helping other women transition from incarceration, work that seemed to align with her insights about manipulation and accountability. Victoria received no direct communication from Melissa during this period, which she interpreted as respectful recognition of the boundaries Victoria had established. The absence of demands for immediate reconciliation or financial assistance suggested that prison had indeed produced some behavioral change. 1 year after Melissa's release, Victoria encountered her unexpectedly at a Sacramento courthouse. They were both attending different proceedings, their professional paths crossing in the building where Victoria had once testified about Melissa's crimes. The encounter was brief but significant. Melissa appeared healthy and professionally dressed, her demeanor subdued but not hostile. She acknowledged Victoria with a polite nod but made no attempt to initiate conversation, apparently respecting the boundaries that had been established. Victoria felt a complex mixture of emotions watching her sister navigate the courthouse competently and quietly. The woman she observed bore little resemblance to the dramatic, manipulative person who had dominated family gatherings for decades. After her court proceeding concluded, Victoria was surprised to find Melissa waiting in the hallway. "I wanted to thank you," Melissa said simply, "for holding me accountable. I know it was hard for you, but it probably saved my life." The acknowledgement was more meaningful than elaborate apologies or dramatic reconciliation attempts. Melissa seemed to understand that accountability had been an act of care rather than revenge, a distinction that demonstrated genuine growth in her understanding of healthy relationships. "I hope things continue to go well for you," Victoria replied, meaning it sincerely while maintaining appropriate emotional distance. The conversation ended without commitments to future contact or promises of restored family relationships. Instead, it represented mutual recognition that growth was possible, even after serious harm had been done, though rebuilding trust would require sustained demonstration rather than dramatic gestures. 5 years after the identity theft prosecution, Victoria was invited to deliver the keynote address at the California Bar Association's annual conference on family law. Her speech, titled "When Love Requires Boundaries," drew on her personal experience while maintaining professional focus on legal and ethical considerations. The presentation was well received, positioning Victoria as a thought leader on the intersection of family relationships and legal accountability. More importantly, it represented her complete integration of personal experience with professional expertise, using trauma as a foundation for helping others rather than allowing it to define her limitations. Victoria's practice continued to grow, specializing in complex family financial crimes and representing clients who faced difficult choices between personal loyalty and legal accountability. Her reputation for ethical practice and personal understanding of the emotional dynamics involved made her sought after by clients facing similar struggles. The professional success was deeply satisfying, representing the transformation of personal pain into public service. Victoria had become the advocate she had needed during her own family crisis, using her experience to guide others through similar challenges. Meanwhile, her marriage to Michael had deepened into a partnership characterized by mutual respect, shared values, and healthy conflict resolution. They had learned to navigate challenges through communication rather than manipulation, creating a relationship that contrasted sharply with the dysfunction Victoria had experienced in their family of origin. They began discussing starting a family of their own, a decision that carried additional weight given Victoria's experiences with destructive family dynamics. "We're hoping the family can come together when Melissa is released," Patricia began hesitantly. "She's learned so much in prison, and we think this could be a fresh start for everyone." Victoria listened as her parents outlined their hopes for restored family harmony, apparently believing that time and consequences had erased the underlying problems that had created their dysfunction. They spoke about forgiveness and moving forward without acknowledging the systematic enabling that had produced the criminal behavior. "What has changed about how you handle conflict and boundaries?" Victoria asked directly. The question seemed to confuse her parents, who had apparently expected discussions about practical arrangements rather than fundamental relationship dynamics. They spoke vaguely about everyone being older and wiser without demonstrating any understanding of the patterns that had created their family's problems. Victoria realized that her parents remained incapable of recognizing their role in enabling Melissa's destructive behavior. They viewed her criminal convictions as unfortunate events rather than predictable consequences of decades of avoiding accountability. "I'm not interested in returning to previous family dynamics," Victoria said clearly. "If Melissa has genuinely changed and you've learned to maintain appropriate boundaries, relationships might be possible in the future. But I won't participate in pretending that nothing happened or that consequences were unfair." Her parents left the meeting disappointed but not surprised. They had hoped that Victoria's success and happiness might make her more willing to prioritize family harmony over personal boundaries, but her response demonstrated that prosperity had actually strengthened her resolve to maintain healthy relationships. 6 months later, Melissa was released from prison to a halfway house, beginning the transition back to independent living. Victoria learned about the release through professional.
The prospect of becoming a parent motivated Victoria to continue her personal growth work, ensuring that she could break cycles of enabling and favoritism that had characterized her upbringing. 7 years after the documentary aired, Victoria received a letter from a viewer whose family situation mirrored her own. The writer's brother had been stealing from their parents while positioning himself as their caregiver, using emotional manipulation to prevent other family members from questioning his behavior. The letter included updates on how the writer had used strategies from Victoria's story to address the situation, ultimately resulting in criminal prosecution and recovery of significant stolen assets. More importantly, the family had learned to maintain boundaries while still providing appropriate support for rehabilitation. Victoria realized that her decision to share her story publicly had created ripple effects she couldn't have anticipated, helping people she would never meet navigate similar challenges. The recognition that personal trauma could be transformed into broader social benefit was profoundly meaningful. As Victoria reflected on her journey from the overlooked daughter to a successful advocate, she recognized that healing had required both personal growth and structural change. Individual therapy had helped her understand her worth and establish boundaries, but legal accountability had been necessary to create actual consequences for destructive behavior. The combination of personal development and legal intervention had produced results that neither approach could have achieved alone. Victoria's family had been forced to confront the reality of their dysfunction through consequences they couldn't manipulate or dismiss. 10 years after discovering her destroyed wedding dress, Victoria stood in her home office preparing for another television interview about family financial crimes. The restored dress hung nearby, in a place of honor, representing traditions worth preserving and boundaries worth defending. Her phone rang with a call from her assistant, confirming the details for tomorrow's filming. The producer had requested the interview specifically because of Victoria's unique perspective as both victim and legal advocate, someone who had experienced family financial abuse and successfully pursued accountability. "Mrs. Torres," her assistant said, using Victoria's married name, "the producer mentioned they'd like to include information about your current relationship with your family members. Are you comfortable discussing recent developments?" Victoria considered the question, thinking about the periodic updates she received about Melissa's continued stability and employment success. There had been no direct contact for several years, but professional networks indicated that her sister had maintained steady employment and avoided legal trouble since her release. "I'll discuss what's relevant to the story," Victoria replied. "The focus should remain on the importance of accountability and the possibility of redemption through genuine change rather than dramatic reconciliation narratives." The distinction was important to Victoria, who had learned that healthy boundaries could coexist with hope for others' growth without requiring personal involvement or emotional investment. She could acknowledge Melissa's apparent positive changes while maintaining the distance necessary for her own well-being. As Victoria prepared for another opportunity to share her story, she reflected on the unexpected path that had led from family dysfunction to professional advocacy. The destroyed wedding dress had been the catalyst for recognizing patterns that might have continued indefinitely without dramatic intervention. The lesson wasn't that families were unimportant or that forgiveness was wrong, but that genuine love sometimes required setting boundaries that felt harsh to people accustomed to avoiding consequences.
Victoria had learned to distinguish between enabling behavior disguised as support and actual care that promoted accountability and growth. The evening before the interview, Victoria and Michael had dinner at their favorite restaurant, discussing the continuing impact of her advocacy work and their plans for the future. Their conversation was marked by the easy intimacy of partners who had weathered significant challenges while maintaining respect and affection for each other. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't pursued the criminal charges?" Michael asked, genuinely curious rather than judgmental. Victoria considered the question seriously. "I think the pattern would have continued indefinitely. Melissa would have found other ways to exploit the family, and I would have continued absorbing damage to maintain peace that was never actually peaceful." The recognition that her choice had likely prevented additional harm to herself and potentially to her parents was comforting. Victoria had made difficult decisions based on principles rather than emotions, prioritizing long-term well-being over short-term comfort. As they left the restaurant, Victoria felt a sense of completion that had been elusive for years. She had transformed personal trauma into professional purpose, used her experience to help others, and built a life based on healthy relationships and meaningful work. The damaged wedding dress had been restored, representing the possibility of healing even after serious violation. Victoria's family relationships remained complicated, but she had learned to find peace without requiring others to change or acknowledge their mistakes. The next morning's interview would provide another opportunity to share insights about the intersection of family loyalty and personal protection, topics that had become central to both Victoria's professional expertise and personal philosophy. Standing in her home office, surrounded by evidence of her professional success and personal growth, Victoria felt grateful for the journey that had led from destruction to advocacy. The path hadn't been easy, but it had been authentic, representing choices based on values rather than fear of disappointing people who had never prioritized her well-being. Victoria Chen had become the woman she was meant to be through pain rather than despite it, transforming family dysfunction into professional purpose and personal trauma into public service. The story that began with a destroyed dress had evolved into a testament to the power of accountability and the possibility of creating meaning from suffering. The destroyed wedding dress had been more than a symbol of family disrespect. It had been a catalyst for recognizing patterns that required intervention rather than acceptance. Victoria's journey from victim to advocate demonstrated that healing was possible when people chose growth over comfort and justice over peace. As Victoria prepared to share her story once again, she understood that the most important audience wasn't the television viewers who would watch her interview, but the people still trapped in similar dynamics who needed permission to prioritize their own well-being over family expectations. Her message remained consistent. Love doesn't require accepting abuse. Loyalty doesn't mean enabling dysfunction. And sometimes the most caring thing you can do for someone is hold them accountable for their choices rather than protecting them from consequences. The woman who had once accepted destroyed property as just another family disappointment had evolved into someone who understood that boundaries weren't barriers to love, but requirements for healthy relationships. Victoria's transformation was complete, representing the triumph of self-respect over people-pleasing and authentic care over manipulative enabling. The restored wedding dress hanging in her office would always remind Victoria of what was possible when people chose to preserve what mattered rather than accommodating those who sought to destroy it. Sometimes saving traditions required rejecting the people who claimed to honor them while actively undermining their meaning. Victoria Chen had learned to be her own advocate, and in doing so had become an advocate for countless others facing similar challenges. The journey from victim to victor had been marked by difficult choices, but each decision had been guided by principles rather than emotions, creating a life worthy of the values she had fought to preserve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.